Perfect.
Woo! Okay, we've got this. All right, let me fly through this now since you've been so inconvenienced by my technical difficulty. All right, so you can still see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, so as Allison mentioned, I'm the program coordinator for the Healthy Beaches program at Maine DEP. And so we work with communities to monitor beach water quality, but we also work with some communities to do additional source tracking work when they have areas that they have pollution concerns in. And so we've been working most recently with the town of Kennebunkport from 2018 till now to address water quality issues in the Goose Rocks Beach watershed. Yes. So I'm not going to go over the details because Allison already shared with you, but I will say the monitoring frequency has increased for the past 3 years. And so typically the beaches in our program where we perform monitoring and assessment and then public notification of water quality issues, typically our communities only monitor their beaches one time a week. Where we have areas with issues or towns that are more proactive, we monitor twice a week, and Kennebunkport is one of those towns where we monitor more frequently to assess water quality at the beaches, and then we are doing the watershed monitoring in addition to that beach water quality testing. We currently monitor 3 active sites at Goose Rocks Beach. We have the names for them are GR1, 2, and 5. So the GR1 and 5 are the 2 river mouths where we have most of our bacteria exceedances. Just means that that's where we have elevated bacteria counts. And then we have our 1 site on Colony Beach. We like to give a shout out to our volunteers. These are some both current and past volunteers because our program was completely voluntary and we couldn't do it without them. So we appreciate everyone who's participated both now and in the past for the town. It's a service to us, but it's also a service to the town, and we're really proud of the support that you all have in your community to do this work. Not a lot of time, so it's pretty great. As Allison mentioned, we've been monitoring in this area because of frequent beach exceedances. And so beach exceedance means that there have been bacteria levels that have been over our safety threshold. And we like to let towns know that this is not the only town with those frequent beach exceedances. This is not the only area where we have some persistent issues with water quality. But this is one of the only areas where we have enough local engagement to try to do something about it. So this is why we're engaged, because the town's engaged. Otherwise, we monitor beach water quality and we let the public know that there's an issue with these advisory overlays for our signs. But some towns don't have the capacity or the local interest to follow up on these issues. So we do here in Kennebunkport, and as you guys probably all know, these are the signs where these advisories will be placed in at the beach locations of your town. As I said, our program is typically about doing beach water quality monitoring and then notifying the public when there's an elevated situation at the beach, and then that's it for most communities. But for those who are more interested, and when we have the capacity, we move beyond to try to assess the risk of illness at some of these beach sites and try to evaluate any of the impairments that we know about or that have been determined in the past and try to figure out what's going on. And so that's what we've been doing here in the Goose Rocks Beach watershed. There's been a lot of work done over many years to try to get at these issues, and we are currently actively trying to do that again as well. And as part of our efforts, we try to establish collaborative partnerships to do this because limited resources dictate what all we can do. And so by forming these partnerships with other municipalities, the EPA, as Allison mentioned, and also other universities, we can do more with less and try to get more support to do these efforts. So we're pretty excited about the partners we've been able to bring into this project so far. Back when the town joined the program in 2004, there were a number of water quality issues, particularly at Goose Rocks Beach, which prompted a water quality effort similar to what we're doing now that the town supported, and Healthy Beaches was a part of that, but not the lead on that project. And so the response to those issues was additional water quality monitoring. That's when they started to evaluate the watershed, not just the beach. And you can see in their cover image here where they had sites all throughout the watershed trying to figure out what was going on. And they did a lot of GIS work to try to map out the different the streams and the water bodies and potential sources. And so they were looking for what we call hotspots, so areas where the bacteria is higher more often than in other areas. And they identified in that report areas where they thought there might be human sources of fecal contamination making its way to downstream beaches at Goose Rocks 1 and 5 at the mouths of the Little River and the Batson River. And their recommendations, among others, were to secure additional funding, because as I said, these monitoring efforts aren't cheap and the fixes aren't cheap, and also to use more source-specific methods, because the bacteria that we test for is not source-specific. It tells us that there is fecal bacteria from a warm-blooded animal, but we don't know if it's a bird, a human, dog, we don't know. So that was one of their recommendations as well. And so we began this after the town reached out to Healthy Beaches to ask, after we had seen more exceedances in recent years of water quality standards. They reached out to say, we want to begin investigating this again and try to figure out what's going on. And so these are just a few members of the Watershed team. I don't have pictures of everyone, but we're really appreciative of everyone who's put in their effort, both at the town and through Maine DEP. It's been quite a team effort between both. When we're looking at this watershed work, we are thinking about sources from many different types of impacts to the beach. So whether that be septic systems, which you're going to hear a little bit more about, whether that's wastewater infrastructure, which you're going to also hear about, specifically sewer infrastructure, birds, wildlife, pets specifically as well. These all sort of diffuse sources combine to create issues at these river mouths and at our beach sites, particularly after we've had a lot of rain. As Allison mentioned, you guys post those rainfall advisories after heavy rain events. Some of the sources we've been thinking about for the Goose Rocks Beach watershed include mammals, birds, gulls, ruminants, canines, humans. These are some of the sources that we're able to test through a partnership with the University of New Hampshire. They've been able to use their DNA tests to identify specific sources from the water samples that we collect, so we have a better sense of what's causing issues in the watershed and how we can more effectively address those issues. We're specifically, primarily concerned with human sources, although we do care about the other sources that are contributing. But when I say human sources, I'm thinking stormwater. Like I said, after rainfall, I'm thinking septic and sewer infrastructure, so any sort of wastewater methods. Those are what we're mainly thinking about when we think about human sources, not specifically people themselves, but some of these wastewater disposal systems and stormwater, which can carry a number of pollutants to the downstream Goose Rocks Beach. As part of our efforts, we've taken what's called a Toolbox Approach. It's pretty common lingo in my world, but it might not be in yours. And so that just means we try to collect as many parameters as we can that help us hone in on areas that may or may not be human sources of pollution. If they're not human sources, then we use other methods of trying to address those pollution issues. And so for the Goose Rocks Beach watershed, we have used bacteria. So NRO, the top item there, which is our common parameter. We've also used optical brighteners. So for those of you who aren't familiar, they're whitening agents in toothpaste and laundry detergents. So they are in wash water, they are in septics, and so it's a pretty low-tech way of trying to get a human source. Through a partnership with the US EPA last year, we were able to incorporate more methods into our testing. So we were able to add in testing for pharmaceuticals and personal care products that are in the water body through their metabolites, so they have to pass through the body. So we tested for a number of those. We also did some additional bacteria and DNA source testing, and then some screening toolkits, so testing for chlorine and ammonia and things like that in the water. But for the last 3 years, we've been primarily focused on the bacteria and opticals, but we've been doing as much DNA and additional testing as we can. I'm sure you're all familiar with Goose Rocks Beach, but just before we start talking about where the sites are located, when we think about Goose Rocks, from our perspective, we're thinking about the major subwatersheds. So the Smith Brook subwatershed in pink, the Little River subwatershed in orange, and the Bassin River subwatershed in yellow. And so, like I said, our primary goal when we started this project was to first evaluate that 2006 report and to look at the sites that they had monitored, which beaches, as I said, was a part of that, and to reevaluate those areas to see if they were still a problem, and if they weren't, if there are new areas that had been a problem. So we were looking for what we call, as I said, hotspots, areas where we have the greatest level of bacteria over that threshold. And so what we found were some major hotspots right down here by Goose Rocks Beach. And so these areas along New Bedford Road here, upstream here, this is the Little River, and then the Bassin, and then Smith Brook. And so areas along in Smith Brook, and then downstream here between Smith, or where the Smith goes into the Bassin. So what we were looking for were hotspots. And what we did with that information is we used that to prioritize the DNA testing that we conducted, because we weren't able to, with limited funding, we weren't able to test every site for every source, so we had to do some prioritizing to figure out where we wanted to test based on where we were having the largest amount of bacteria exceedances. So to orient you to my next figure, I want to show you what these big icons stand for. And so I want to show you sort of visually where in the watershed we were seeing different sources. And so if you see a black square with an M, that means a mammal. So a mammal is general. It includes humans, it includes ruminants and dogs. It's this overall group. And then you have humans specifically. This cute little guy here is representing birds. It's the best icon I could find. And I couldn't find another bird, so here's a gull. Here's your big G for a gull. The dog, of course, is canine, and this little sheep here is a ruminant. So cow, sheep, things like that. So now that you know what this means, hopefully you can all see this pretty well. But what I wanted to do is, rather than pull out numbers and get into those sort of specifics, I wanted to show you visually where over the past 2 years where we have been able to test for sources, where we have seen different sources. And so some of these areas haven't been tested for everything. So don't think that the absence of an icon means there's nothing there. It's just these are what we found in those areas. And so I just wanted to show you, sort of give you a representation that sites down here at the river mouth, and this icon should be moved over. This map was just before we moved it. But yeah, so the river mouth site here, Goose Rocks 5, we've found in at least one sample, again, this doesn't tell you how many samples, but at least one sample, we've had dog DNA, gulls, humans, mammals, and birds. The only one you don't see is the ruminant. We haven't found any ruminants anymore. But in other areas, so say here, where the Bassin River meets the section where the Smith and the Bassin come together, so far we've only found dog and mammal DNA. But we have seen humans upstream. So, it's a grab sample, which just means it's a water scoop. And so sometimes you don't capture a specific source in that sample. It's all kind of the luck of the draw, but we do our best to remain consistent and collect them in the exact same spot to be representative over time. But you can see there are differences throughout the watershed, and we do have canine DNA in areas near the Little River, also at the mouth over here of the Little River at Goose Rocks 1. We're seeing canine DNA throughout the watershed. And we're also seeing, of course, mammal, which can be any mammal, and then human in different areas throughout the watershed as well. So here, so we're seeing several different sources, which helps us prioritize our efforts. And just to give you a sense of, you see all these icons, but what does that mean? How many samples had human? How many did this? I wanted to give you an idea. So out of the samples that we tested for human DNA, 20% of those samples came back positive for human DNA in them. Out of all of the samples we tested for canine DNA, 46%, so almost half of the samples we tested had canine DNA. And then birds, 93% of the samples. Birds are pretty ubiquitous throughout a watershed, as you can imagine. So it makes sense that we would find bird DNA. Mammal DNA was in all samples. As you can imagine, in the watershed like this one, where you have all sorts of wildlife, mammal DNA is prevalent. And we've seen that in every other watershed we've tested, where we've had mammal nearly 100% of the time. We have yet to capture ruminants in any samples in this watershed, but they have been in some of our other watersheds. So what are we doing with this data? There is, of course, more data that we've collected, but I'm not going to bore you with all of it right now. But what's the point, and what are we doing with it? So we work with communities to try to transform that data into something actionable. And so we want to help them identify these issues, not just say what they are, but where are they coming from? What could they be coming from, so that they can be removed and hopefully prevented in the future. And so we are continuing our enhanced monitoring this year. So we've been out twice to the watershed. We're continuing that work to try to verify if any pollution sources have been removed, to see if those areas are showing better water quality. We're continuing to use this data to try to help the town inform their investigative efforts of their wastewater infrastructure and surveying of property, septics, and also to help with work with Allison for additional education and outreach initiatives. We've had a lot of successes. I mean, it seems like a lot. It seems like maybe, you don't have all the answers, but we've identified problem areas. There, as Allison said, there's been wastewater investigations. We have developed databases for septic and stormwater. We've done outreach. There's been a lot of successes over the past couple of years. And speaking of the wastewater, I'm going to let Chris and Warner discuss that, and then I'll be back to finish up some other sections. So I'm going to take it to Chris now.
All right, can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So some of the efforts that we had made during this whole investigation, we kind of started in September. So September 30th through around October 18th, the crews spent several weeks down there uncovering manholes and cleaning our wastewater lines down there. When I say cleaning, I mean jetting. This was in an effort to pre-clean everything before EcoClaim came down to camera those lines. I'd like to say a special thanks to the Fire Chief, Jay Everett. He actually sped up the process quite a bit for us by having a tanker truck available for us, so that we had a uninterrupted water supply. It made things go a lot quicker for us. So October 10th, we actually dye tested the force main that runs.
So Chris, she has the PowerPoint up, and I think Megan's looking for direction on what, if you want a particular slide up.
Sure. Actually, if we can stay with that slide.
Okay.
So on October 10th, we actually dye tested the force main that runs from pump station 13 under Beaver Pond Brook over to Sandpoint Road. Upon doing that, we had no indications of anything that was compromised or any exfiltration. There was no evidence of that. October 21st, EcoClean arrived, and they completed some camera work on almost 5,000 feet of gravity mains. This was done in the area of Dyke Road, New Bedford Road, Kings Highway, and Sandpoint Road. Again, we had no indications of exfiltration or seriously compromised infrastructure. We did see some minor infiltration from manhole covers, as well as a few sagging lines, but nothing that would cause any leaks or anything like that. If you want to advance to the next one, Megan. And then on October 29th, we spent the morning pigging or cleaning our major force main. And this is from pump station 12, which is down near the intersection of Dyke Road. This is what actually pumps all the wastewater from Goose Rocks Beach back to Cape Porpoise. This force main is almost 13,000 feet long. Again, we had help from Chief Everett and the fire department. He supplied a fire truck for us to help us with these efforts. So after pigging the force main, we also dye tested it. Again, we didn't have any observation of any exfiltration there. I did go down and monitor Batson River for almost 3 hours myself during this process. And again, there were no signs of exfiltration whatsoever. If you want to advance to the next one, Megan. So I don't think you'll probably find these facts too interesting or anything else, but again, that force main is 13,000 feet long. At this point in time, there's no reason to believe that any of the infrastructure down there with the wastewater is compromised that could be contributing to any of these issues.
Does it follow the road, Chris?
So the force main that runs from pump station 12, which is down by the intersection of Dyke Road, does follow Kings Highway toward the west. Ultimately, goes off into the Sandy Beach area, underwater, and back up onto Marshall Point Road. And from there, it follows Marshall Point Road right to Cape Porpoise.
So at times at low tide, you can see a very large black pipe that gets exposed. That's the force main?
That's correct, yes.
So it does get exposed at some tides, but that's not an issue.
Right.
All
And
right.
you'll also see there's a big, large concrete ballast there that actually holds the pipe down.
Right, right.
And that'll be exposed at times as well.
I've seen it. Yep. Far out.
Does anybody have any questions?
All right, Warner, your turn.
All right. So,
Werner, Chris was very concise.
I know
Subtle hint from your boss, Warner.
he did a very nice job. So yeah, Megan, if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. So as you can imagine, and everybody knows, the vast majority of the Goose Rocks Beach area, is on the town sewer. But we do have a fair amount of properties that are located, within the watershed that are on septic. And so as part of our investigation, we worked to create a database listing, of a little over 200 properties that, are in the greater watershed. And so some of the things that we looked at specifically were, for the age of the systems, dates that they were installed, whether or not, we had adequate records or not for these. And from those, listings, once we mapped those out, we narrowed the data research down to, from that 197 down to 26 properties that we felt warranted a closer look, that were more closer in terms of locations within the watershed. And then from those 26, investigated about 14 of those properties, some of which, what we found were systems that appear to be functioning adequately, depending on what the usage was. So when we do an on-site investigation, we're looking for those obvious indications of a failure. We're looking for those those patches of green grass that wouldn't normally that may not normally show up in the yard. We're looking, we do the squish test, in the yard, any if there's any obvious examples of outbreak, that you may wind up seeing. And of note, we did not have any properties that that showed up as having any visual or obvious outbreaks. We did offer up to property owners, who wish to participate with us if they wanted, if they agreed to a dye test. So we did dye test a number of properties that were specifically close to the water body, any obvious outbreaks or failures. We did.
Warner, what were the other 18? We did 14 out of 26. What were the other 18?
So in some cases, where where we approached property owners, we weren't necessarily able to get onto the property because we didn't have the consent of the property owner. So some of those, we weren't able to do complete follow-ups on. But as much as we could, within the water body, we're able to check to see if there were any obvious indicators or not.
Does that concern you at all, that the 18 that perhaps seem to have an issue of not letting you on? That concerns me. Does it concern you?
Well, as I said, does it concern me? Well, yes and no. I mean, there are some property owners that just aren't interested in in inviting a town representative into their house to flush dye tablets down the toilet. Some of these systems, we do know we have a number of older properties that have undocumented systems. As best we can, we research around the periphery, around the water bodies for obvious sources, as best we can without entering the property if we're not given permission. And I think, Megan can speak a little bit to that, is that if we do think that on some of these later on, we do have the option of enlisting the DEP, which carries some greater administrative search capacities than the town does. If we think we have a specific issue on a property, we did have one property that was up in the Tyler Brook watershed that was in a state of failure, but the property owner was in the process of having that system replaced, and as such that that system that we didn't have documented because of its age has since been replaced, and that was right around the time when when the DNA testing was being done. So while I'd like to say that would knock out some of the human issues that we may have been happening, we won't truly know until there's further follow-up testing done further on down in the watershed at a later date. Next slide. As I stated, it would be great if we had found an obvious issues, but we didn't find any evident failures, relative to septic systems. But as such, we continue to always educate property owners that we come into contact with. When there's new systems that are put in, we make sure that property owners understand, that their system is something that that needs to be maintained. We encourage regular pump outs, of their tanks, as well as just good practices in terms of what it is that they put down the drain, and recognizing that they're not on a sewer system and that they need to be careful in terms of what they put in, because that's going to definitely affect the longevity and the lifespan of their system.
All right. I will continue on just along those lines. Some of the work that Warner has been doing, we've been able to use some of the staff with DEP that have been working for me to turn that into something visual, a little bit more visual, where we have some staff who have the time. So creating septic system and stormwater databases, trying to collate all of this information to help keep track of when areas were investigated and the age of property or septic systems on properties, just to try to help prioritize efforts. So that's all been part of this work as well.
Megan, excuse me, I'm sorry. Before we move on, I just would like to just mention one more thing.
Sure.
It seems to me that we have a number of older properties and folks that are probably on fixed income. To replace a septic system is considerable amount of money. I could imagine if I were in a situation, that's something that would be very, very frightening to me and difficult. Are there any programs that the town or the state offers where money could be presented and then maybe put as a lien on the property, so at least the individual could still remain living there without being priced out of, is there anything that we can have people not fear the expense if something's discovered? It just worries me that that could be a real disincentive to have people cooperate and do and have it tested. But is there anything like that in place?
I can't speak to the towns because some towns do have that, but not all of them do. But there have been funding opportunities in the past. There's been loan programs. Some towns that have been able to secure grant funding to do some of this watershed work. As part of that grant funding, they've been able to help property owners, share the cost of some of these connections to sewers. And so I plan, and part of our reporting, there are a couple of funding avenues that I have been made aware of in the past. I don't know what the status of those are right now, but I can certainly follow up with those details because there have been such programs in the past. But you're right, it's expensive and it's a very quite a large deterrent for people to want to have their systems tested if they think that they may have to tie into sewer.
Precisely. So hopefully we'll look into that in some way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Lori or Allison, you guys don't have any sort of cost sharing program there locally for that kind of work, do you?
We don't have a cost sharing program, no. State law does allow the selectmen to lien a property and replace the septic system if it's deemed to be malfunctioning after it follows a legal process requesting and demanding that the owner replace the system. But in this case, we don't have any malfunctioning systems that we've been made aware of and haven't gone through that process.
Right. Okay. Well, I will certainly follow up with those details for you all. And I'm going to let Allison now share some of the details which ties in really well with the septic competition of some of the work that's been done to promote outreach in the watershed.
Okay, so as Megan and Warner both said, septic education is key right now with getting some information out to the community and to homeowners. And so last fall in 2019, we did, Sarah, who worked for AmeriCorps and for Megan at DEP with Maine Healthy Beaches, we provided some septic education packets that were distributed to over 100 homes in the Goose Rocks areas, along with making them available at last fall's Beach Advisory Committee meeting and at the November elections. This information is also currently available at the Public Health Office and on the Public Health website. And we plan to continue to educate the community on good septic practices. Unfortunately, COVID has thrown a loop for education and distributing a lot of things at the moment, but we're working through that all. But last fall also, Sarah, the AmeriCorps worker, personalized the Goose Rocks Beach What to Do with Dog Do flyer. And she specialized at 2 Goose Rocks specifically with the dog rules and the reminder of cleaning up after your dog, plover education and reminding dog owners to keep their dog on the leash. She put all the dog hours and leash hours and everything on that flyer. And that is available at my office. And I will continue to distribute it as I can.
Allison, we can't hear you, or I can't.
So the last slide that was just up was the flyer that Sarah had worked on altering for Goose Rocks Beach specifically to take care of dogs and the plovers and everything like that. Okay, you can go to the next slide now. So currently, right now, we have this swimming advisory sign at all the entrances of Goose Rocks Beach. And it talks about the rain events and bacteria elevations. It has a link to the Public Health Department along with Maine Healthy Beaches. And it talks about when we test our beach seasonally. And that Velcro strip at the bottom is where I would put the signs if we had a contamination advisory or a rainfall advisory. So you can go to the next slide.
Again, I'm beating a dead horse here, but when it comes time to update that sign, I would wish it would also mention that the bacterial levels tend to be high at low tides, and to make that people also aware of the fact of swimming at low tides at the mouths of the river extends
Right.
your risk of exposure. I think that's scientifically sound.
Okay, so that's kind of what we're working on right now is, and we did put up a caution sign this year. As you can see, it's under that Town of Kennebunkport swimming advisory sign now, and it's at both ends of the rivers, the Little and the Batson, and it says the mouths of the Batson and Little rivers periodically experience elevated bacteria levels, especially during and after rainfall. And it's advised to swim on the ocean side of Goose Rocks Beach and to avoid water contact in the rivers for 24 to 48 hours following rainfall. And it links us to the public health office or to Maine Healthy Beaches for more information.
Again, that's wonderful. It does not mention low tide, and I think it should. But next time we can do it. I would hope you would consider that on an update.
Well, we have been working on all this. It's been kind of a work in progress, and we have noted that not all low tides have bacteria high levels, but there are a significant amount. So we're just trying to figure out how to get that education out there.
I think you find that most are at elevated levels, and then they can go above the number, but fair. Okay, thank you.
All right.
So as I said, we have had a lot of successes, but we have a lot more work to do. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. There's a lot going on, but we are planning to continue monitoring. As Werner said, there's more investigations planned, and we're going to continue our work with improving the spatial and the data, the mapping to help the town with some of these investigations. I'm currently working on sharing any funding opportunities that I'm made aware of through my position, and supporting additional outreach this summer, thinking a little more creatively in light of COVID-19, but we're still working on providing that education as we've spoken about. And so these are just some of the examples of the outreach we've done in other communities, but we're continuing on with those efforts. I will end it for questions for anybody who has presented today.